Hello, and welcome to Politics and Societies of Southeast Europe. Our topic for this week is language. So we'll be talking about language disputes and about movements in the contemporary period for language purity in the region. First, I want to talk a little bit about what a language is and why it matters what we say a language is. Then I want to talk a little bit about linguistic diversity in the region, the different languages that are spoken, and the one language that we're going to focus on, the language that was called until recently Serbo-Croatian. And then in the third section, I want to move more toward the contemporary period and talk about policies of language separation and efforts to establish the distinctiveness of different languages which were considered in the past and in some places are still considered to be variants of Serbo-Croatian. So let's begin with the topic of what is a language and what is not a language, or what is the difference between a language and a dialect. And I have to confess from the outset, I sometimes feel as though there is not really anything particularly intelligent that can be said about this question, the difference between a language and a dialect. The distinctions that are made are not linguistic distinctions. They don't have a scientific basis. They're distinctions that are grounded in politics, but maybe it will help if we take a step back. The first thing that I want to offer you is a quotation. It is usually attributed to the essayist and man of letters, as they used to call them, Max Weinreich, his definition of a language, which is right there, the first item on the slide. He says a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So it's a little bit of a comical definition. What it's meant to point to is the degree to which the adoption of a language and the characterization of a habit of speech and writing and communication as a language, as opposed to it being something else, a dialect, is an expression of political power and an expression of political goals. And this operates within the context. If we ask what language is, one way of answering the question would be to ask the question of what language does. And in that case, if we're talking about the functions of language, here are some of the main things that we can say that languages do. First, language mediates in the interaction between people. We can communicate with one another without using spoken and written languages. There are other types of means of communication that are sometimes referred to as language, the language of gesture and expression and movement and so on. People talk about body language, but language is a relatively efficient way of mediating in the interaction between people. But look at the second point here. When we use language as an instrument to mediate between one another in communication, we do it in a way that has some political characteristics. All of our interactions with language are in many ways structured by politics, because things like the registers that are used, word choices, accents, indications of social location, show also that language is an expression of power. The ability to determine what is standard and what is non-standard language is an expression of power. The revelations that people make about their social or regional or other origins through the ways in which they use language place them in a social position in relation to other people. The establishment of one language as the official language, or one variant of language as the accepted variant of a language in a particular place, is an expression of the power of some social groups over other social groups. And third, we can also say that language is an historical marker. Languages change over time, and one of the things that you can tell from usage of language and the sorts of language conventions that are employed is where you are historically, and if you are in a particular moment, whether you identify more with communication conventions of the present or of the past. All of this is to say that language is very closely connected with questions of politics, and one of the reasons that language is closely connected with questions of politics is that it's closely connected with questions of identity. And this is a phenomenon that we can trace back in time, but the point in time to which most people would trace it functionally is the 19th century, when scholars, these were German and Austrian scholars for the most part, like Herder and like a couple of people that you have probably certainly heard of in another context, the Brothers Grimm, uh, made it their business to connect what they regarded as the cultural characteristics of the peoples of Europe in their case, and to draw the distinctions that could be drawn between them using these cultural characteristics. So most people are probably familiar with the folk tales collected by the Brothers Grimm, and some selection of them has become a standard part of literature for children in many parts of the world. The Grimms went around as a kind of anthropological work collecting these folk tales in different parts of Europe, thinking that by collecting the stories that are commonly told among a group of people, they will gain an understanding of the character of the people. But they had another purpose also in collecting these stories, because the stories are told through language. Now, the languages that were spoken in most parts of Europe at the time were almost entirely spoken languages, that is, not written, not codified, not with a standardized grammar. They and their students set about to create dictionaries and grammars and standardized forms of these languages, the idea being that language is the core of the character of a nation. It is through language that nations are created and maintained, and through language that it becomes possible to distinguish one nation from one another. This intellectual project was related to a political project, and that was the big project of the 19th century in Europe, the creation of national identities leading to the creation of national states. And what is it that a nation needs to have in order to gain or acquire or demand the status of a state-carrying or state-forming nation? A national language, a national culture, a national history, and national symbols. And it is through this process and through different understandings of this process that we get a variety of the different understandings of nationalism and national movements and their history and their meaning. So we have critical historians looking back on this period like Eric Hobsbawm, who talks about the invention of tradition, the selection of a small number of symbols and images and figures out of the tradition of the past and turning some of them into images of national identity, taking them out of the social process and elevating them to the role of unifying symbols. Or you have Ernst Renan, another theorist of nationalism who we've talked about earlier in this class during this term, talking about the process of creating a national culture and a national history as a process of memory, but also as a process of forgetting, a point that is picked up by Stuart Hall, who talks about the effort to create a shared past and a shared identity as a project of unification that is achieved by suppressing difference in the past and imposing unity on the past. So declaring that the languages, almost all of which are invented in the sense that they become standardized and codified languages in the 19th century, are projected back into the past as existing beyond history, as being a unifying symbol. And the importance of language in this sense, the importance of language in terms of structuring identities with the purpose of creating a nation, can be seen in some decolonizing and post-colonial projects in which in some cases national languages were invented, or languages that were no longer in use in everyday communication were drawn out of the past and reformed in order to become national languages. The most frequent examples that are used of this would be languages like Hebrew and Irish, which existed mostly in the form either of languages used only for religious purposes or local spoken dialects, but became developed to the point that they also have dictionaries, grammars to take the status of a national language. Uh, Final point I will make about language is that the question of what language is the dominant or official spoken or written language in a place is a secondary question during most of human history. The question of what language is dominant does not matter very much during the part of history, and that is most of history, when most of the population was not literate. So the language of administration, what language you use to communicate with official agencies, what language education is carried out in, what language is used to fill out the forms that you use to gain benefits from government, this becomes an important question only with the rise of the modern bureaucratic state and of near universal education and near universal literacy. But it's because of this that language is associated with nations, with borders, and with the difference between nations and the constitution of borders. This image, this is an image from a political flyer that I found online, and I am still not certain whether its intention is satirical or not. But it has the slogan right there in the center: language maintains borders. And what you've got there is a whole list surrounding the borders of a country. In this case, the country is Serbia, of in small print and crossed out, there are expressions that are borrowed from other languages and that are in common use and in everyday speech. And below, in larger print and not crossed out, is what is regarded as the linguistically correct or pure expression that should be adopted in other languages. So you have examples there. What are some of them? Um, some of them are funny, so that the expression junkie is one that is not supposed to be in use, and they say instead of that, the literal term for a drug addict, narcoman, should be used. Others, the word borrowed from English, grill, should not be used, but rather roshtil should be used. One of my favorites is that the popular breakfast dish, ham and eggs, is called almost everywhere in the region, phonetically ham and eggs. They have crossed that out and said it should be called jaja sa shunkum, or literally egg with ham. But in any case, this is an example of one of the contemporary movements for language purity that we'll be talking about later. The basic principle that I want to draw out of it is the principle that language is used as an instrument for establishing and maintaining distinction, distinctions that are grounded in conceptions of identity that have political implications.